Good evening, and welcome to the Obscura Institute. The lamps are lit, the archive is open, and tonight we draw a single file down from the shelves. File 13. The Mystery of Dyatlov Pass. Settle in, make yourself comfortable, and let us begin. There is a photograph taken on the 28th of January 1959 at an abandoned settlement called Second Northern, a scatter of empty wooden houses at the edge of the northern Urals. 10 young people from the city of Sverdlovsk had got that far together, by train and truck, and then on skis, with heavy packs, heading north into the mountains in the middle of winter. In the photograph, one of them is going home. Yuri Yudin, 21, had joint and back pain that had flared up badly enough that going on would have made him a liability to the others, so he sorted through his pack, handed over the things they might need, and said his goodbyes. Lyudmila Dubinina has both arms around him. She is laughing, and so is he, and behind the two of them, the others stand about in the snow with their packs at their feet, in no particular hurry to move. It is the last photograph of all 10 of them together, and Yudin kept it for the rest of his life. He lived another 54 years and died in 2013 at the age of 75, the only one of the 10 to grow old at all. The other 9 went on north. What happened to them a few days later has been turned over by investigators, writers and scientists ever since. And this is the story of both halves of that. 9 people on a winter trip and the 50 years and more of people trying to understand them. These were not beginners. Most of them were students or recent graduates of the Ural Polytechnic Institute in Sverdlovsk, the city now called Yekaterinburg, and they had been hiking and skiing together for years. Their leader was Igor Dyatlov, 23, a radio engineering student who had built some of the group's own equipment by hand, the radio gear and the little stove among it. He had led winter trips before, and so had most of the people with him. Zinaida Kolmogorova was 22, Yuri Doroshenko, 21, Rustem Slobodin, 23. Lyudmila Dubinina, the one laughing in the photograph, was 20. Alexander Kolevatov was 24. Georgy Krivonishchenko, 23, was called Yuri by nearly everyone and worked at the nuclear site then known as Chelyabinsk 40. Nikolai Thibault Brignol, also 23, carried a French surname that had come down to him through a family line, reaching him, in the end, inside a Soviet labor camp where he was born while his father was imprisoned there. The oldest of them, by a long way, was Semyon Zolotaryov, who was 38, a frontline veteran of the Second World War and a professional instructor at a hiker's base at Kurovka, where groups like this one were trained and outfitted. He was not a student, he had joined late, and none of the others knew him particularly well. His name, like several of the others, is spelled a few different ways in the surviving documents, because the records of 1959 were not tidy, and neither were the decades of retelling that came after them. The trip they held a permit for was rated Category 3, the hardest grade the Soviet system recognized, which meant at least 300 kilometers on skis in severe winter conditions. Their goal was Mount Ototen in the northern Urals, about 10 kilometers north of the slope where the story ends, and finishing the route would have earned several of them the top certificate a Soviet hiker could hold. The dates are all in the file. The route book had been issued in Sverdlovsk before they set out. The train left the city on the 23rd of January. They came through Ivdel and rode on by truck to Vizhai on the 25th. Went further in the next day to a logging settlement, and from the 28th, the 9 of them were on skis, moving through forest and frozen river valleys in the short light of a northern winter. They kept diaries, personal and collective, and they carried several cameras and used them constantly. The frames that survive show them clowning about in the snow, hauling a heavy sled between them, faces raw with cold, a stove smoking inside the tent. It reads, all of it, like a group of friends having a good and difficult time together. By the 31st of January, they had reached the edge of the highlands where the trees give out. On the 1st of February, they built a supply cache, a labaz, a stash of food and spare gear buried in the snow to be dug up on the way back. And then they climbed onto the eastern shoulder of a mountain the local Mansi people call Kholat Shiakhl, usually translated as Dead Mountain. At around 5 in the afternoon, they stopped and pitched their tent. People have wondered about that choice ever since. They were on a bare, wind-scoured slope above the tree line in the open when a descent of a kilometre or so would have put them among trees, out of the wind, with firewood to hand. The likeliest reason is a dull one. They had lost height earlier by drifting off course. They were tired, and camping high saved them the climb in the morning. Experienced groups did it, and Dyatlov had done it before. Before they left Vijay, Dyatlov had agreed to send a telegram to the university sports club once they were out again. It was expected somewhere around the 12th of February. The telegram did not arrive, and for a while that meant very little to anybody. Late telegrams were common on trips like this one, and a few days either way was normal. It was only when relatives began pressing the institute that a search was organized, and volunteers started moving into the area around the 20th of February. Students and staff at first, then soldiers and prison service personnel with dogs and aircraft. On the 26th, 2 student searchers, Mikhail Sharavin and Boris Slobtsov, working their way along the eastern slope of Kholat Shiakhl, found the tent at the elevation marker known as Height 1079. It was still standing. Half collapsed, dug slightly into the slope so that it sat level. One end weighed down with snow and sagging under it, with skis stuck upright as poles and the lines that held it still pegged out. Inside, almost nothing had been disturbed. Rucksacks were laid out along the floor. There were boots and warm outer clothing, blankets, an axe, a stove, a store of food with some of it set out as though a meal was being prepared, a camera and money, which mattered a great deal in 1959 and which nobody robbing a camp would leave behind. What the searchers could not account for was the fabric. There were openings in the wall of the tent that did not belong there, and the edges of them looked wrong. The question went to forensic examination, and an expert named Henrietta Cherkina gave the answer that has anchored the case ever since. The major openings had been made from the inside by somebody standing in the tent with a knife, cutting outward through the wall rather than using the entrance a few feet away. That one finding narrows things a great deal. The cuts were the work of somebody inside the tent, not somebody outside it. Whatever the 9 of them were getting away from, they made the opening themselves, and they went through it quickly enough that stopping for boots was not something any of them did. Then, in the dark, in temperatures well below freezing, on an exposed mountainside, they walked away from everything that could have kept them alive. The snow outside the tent had held their tracks. Wind had scoured and drifted the slope in the weeks since, so the record was partial, but there was enough of it left to read. Searchers counted 8 or 9 sets of footprints leading away downhill, preserved as raised columns of packed snow with the loose stuff blown off from around them, which is a thing that happens on wind-hammered ground. The tracks ran roughly 1.5 kilometers down toward the tree line to the northeast, side by side, with no sign of running or scattering anywhere along them. There was 1 set of prints for each person, and none belonging to anybody else, no marks of a struggle, and nothing to suggest that anyone had been following them. And some of the prints had been made by feet that were bare, or in socks, or wearing a single shoe. At the bottom, at the edge of the forest, stood a large cedar. Beneath it, the searchers found the remains of a small fire, and the first two of the group, Yuri Doroshenko and Georgy Krivonischenko, stripped down to their underclothes. Branches on the cedar were broken as high as 5 meters up, so somebody had climbed it for firewood or to look back up the slope toward the tent. Between the cedar and the tent, spread out along that same line, they found 3 more. Dyatlov lay about 300 meters up from the tree, one hand still holding a birch branch. Zinaida Kolmogorova was further up again, and Rustem Slobodin between the two of them, face down under a layer of packed snow. All 3 were lying with their heads uphill, which some accounts take to mean they had turned around at some point in the night and were making their way back toward the tent, though that reading has never been confirmed. That accounted for 5 of them. The last 4 were not found in February, or in March, or in April. They were found on the 4th of May, when the snow began to go. They lay in a ravine about 75 meters beyond the cedar, under something like 4 meters of snow, and beneath that snow was something that had been built. A den, dug out and floored with cut fir branches, the sort of shelter you make when you mean to get through the night. In it and around it were Lyudmila Dubinina, Semyon Zolotaryov, Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, and Alexander Kolevatov. They were better dressed than the 2 under the tree, and the reason for that is one of the quiet, hard details in the file. Some of what they were wearing had belonged to Krivonischenko and had been cut away with a knife, a piece of his trousers wrapped around Dubinina's foot. The medical examinations were done through the spring, and their conclusions are plainer than the retellings suggest. 6 of the 9 had died of hypothermia. 3 had died of injuries, a fracture of the skull in Thibault-Brignol's case, broken ribs in Dubinina's and Zolotaryov's, and the examiner noted the kind of force that seemed far too great for anything they could see, with the skin over those injuries largely unmarked. Months in a snow-filled ravine with meltwater running through it had done what months in meltwater do. The examiners found nothing that pointed to another person. There was one more finding that has traveled a long way since. Testing on some of the clothing showed elevated beta radiation, faint traces of the kind picked up at the plant where one of them worked, in a report dated the 27th of May, 1959. Krivonischenko had worked at a nuclear site in a region with a known history of contamination, and the simplest reading, which is the one a later review settled on, is that the traces came onto the mountain with the clothes. The criminal case was opened on the 26th of February 1959 by the prosecutor Vasily Tempelov and closed 3 months later on the 28th of May by the lead investigator Lev Ivanov. Its conclusion is the strangest document in the whole affair, not because it says something wild, but because it says almost nothing at all. The hikers, it found, had died as the result of a compelling natural force, stihina sila, an elemental force, which they were unable to overcome. No mechanism was named, and no cause was given, and nothing anywhere in the file explains what it was that 9 capable people had been unable to beat. The file was sent to a secret archive, and the area was closed to hikers for the next 3 years. A few things in the file are firm and worth holding on to. 6 of the 9 died of hypothermia, and 3 died of injuries. Nobody had been shot, stabbed, or struck by another person in any way the examiners could identify. And there were no footprints on that slope apart from the hiker's own. In 1990, more than 30 years after he had closed the case, Lev Ivanov spoke about it publicly. He said, without much hedging, that he had never had a rational explanation for what he had investigated. He also said that he had been ordered to drop a line of inquiry involving lights in the sky, glowing spheres that searchers and local people had reported seeing in the region around that time, and that he had done as he was told. He did not sound, 30 years on, like a man who had made his peace with it. That instruction and the closed archive have kept the military versions of the story alive ever since. Rocket tests, weapons trials, something the state preferred forgotten. Investigators going back over it much later worked through the launch records and found nothing that had gone up anywhere near the pass on the nights in question. The local Mansi people were suspected for a short while in 1959 and cleared that same spring, since there were no prints on the slope but the hiker's own, and the Mansi had been helping with the search from the beginning. Donnie Icar was an American writer who became preoccupied with the case and went to the pass himself in winter to stand where the tent had been. What he brought back was a theory about wind. The shape of the ridge above the camp in a strong, steady wind might set up a repeating pattern of vortices, what physicists call a Kármán vortex street, producing sound at a frequency too low for the ear to catch, and low-frequency sound of that kind has been associated with unease and dread. Icar's suggestion in his 2013 book Dead Mountain was that the group had been driven out of the tent by a physical sensation of terror they could neither identify nor escape. Acoustics researchers were not convinced, and said so. Johan Gaume is a snow scientist, and the story he tells about how he came to this work begins with going to see Disney's Frozen. He watched the animated snow move on the screen and thought that the code behind it could be made to behave like the real thing, so he went to the studio in Hollywood and asked the animators how they had done it. He was building avalanche models, and the snow in them needed to move properly. The pass came to him later by way of Alexander Puzrin, an engineer at ETH Zurich, and together they set about modeling what a small avalanche on that particular slope would actually do. Underneath all of these, quietly, there is ordinary medicine. Two well-documented behaviors of severe hypothermia account for a good deal. The first is paradoxical undressing. As the body loses its fight to hold heat, the vessels near the skin relax and produce a sudden, overwhelming sensation of burning, and people pull off their clothes. The second is terminal burrowing, in which people in the last stage of hypothermia crawl into confined spaces, under furniture, or into snow. Between them, they cover the two men in their underclothes beneath the cedar, and possibly the den dug into the floor of the ravine as well. In 2019, Russia's Prosecutor General's office reopened the case, agreeing before it started to look only at the weather, avalanche, snow slab, or hurricane-force wind. On the 11th of July 2020, a deputy head of the office, Andrei Kuryakov, announced the finding, which was a slab avalanche followed by hypothermia. In his account, the group cut their way out, retreated the distance they had been trained to retreat, and then could not find the tent again in visibility of about 16 meters and a wind chill of -40 or worse. It was a heroic struggle, he said. There was no panic, but they had no chance. 6 months later, in January 2021, Gaume and Puzrin published their model in the journal Communications, Earth and Environment. A slab avalanche is not a wall of snow coming down the mountain. It is a single stiff plate of it, a few meters across, sliding a step or two. The conditions they describe are particular ones. The ground under the snow at height 1079 is irregular, with steps in it, so the local angle is steeper than the slope appears, somewhere around 28 to 30 degrees. The group cut into the slope to get the tent level, which takes support away from the snow above it, and katabatic winds, cold, dense air draining downhill off the high ground, kept loading fresh snow onto that weakened plate for hours after the tent went up. Two of their sources became well known. The snow in the model was animated with the code adapted from Frozen, and to argue that a small block of it could break ribs, They drew on cadaver studies done by General Motors in the 1970s for seatbelt research, which had measured the forces a human chest can take. Their point was that a person lying on a rigid, packed bed of skis absorbs a blow very differently from a person standing up in open snow. Gaume and Puzrin have been careful about the claim. They argue that it is plausible rather than that it is proved, and other researchers were not convinced and said so. The objections the searchers raised in 1959 have never gone away either. They described the snow crust above the tent as unbroken, with footprints and even urine marks near the camp still readable weeks afterwards. There was no debris around the tent, and the tent was still standing when Sharavin and Slobtsov reached it. And the walk of 1.5 kilometers downhill, rather than a few meters to the side, still has to be read as a decision about surviving the night rather than as an escape from falling snow. So some things remain unsettled, and they are not small ones. We do not know whether they died on the 1st of February or the 2nd. We do not know what happened inside the tent to begin it. And the mechanism behind the injuries is still a model of what could have happened rather than a record of what did. Yuri Yudin kept the photograph and kept answering questions about his friends patiently for more than 50 years, without ever claiming to know the answer. When he died in 2013, he was buried in Yekaterinburg, in the same cemetery as most of the others. Among the things left in the tent was a joke newspaper the group had put together, a single sheet they called the Evening Ottoten, dated the 1st of February and full of in-jokes about the trip and a mock scholarly debate about whether the snowman exists. It is the sort of thing tired people write to make each other laugh at the end of a long day on skis. We know as much about their days as we do because they wrote everything down and photographed each other constantly. And so what survives of them is mostly ordinary. Diaries, a heavy sled being hauled uphill, a stove smoking, jokes about a snowman, and a great many pictures of one another in the snow. Of all the explanations put forward, a sudden slab of sliding snow, a gust of infrasound, something they saw in the dark. Which one do you find you can actually believe? Tell us below, and that is where we leave File 13 for tonight. Thank you for spending this quiet hour in the archive. If you enjoyed this case file, a like and a subscribe genuinely help the Institute grow. And turning on notifications means the next file finds you the moment it opens. The lamps will stay lit and the Institute will be here whenever you wish to return. Until then, rest well.